Our guest today is a good friend of mine who is what I would describe as perhaps the ultimate energy nerd. Funny fact, we went to the same university, UQ in Brisbane, which is where he's originally from and where he studied engineering. I just realized doing research for this actually that we had about 2-year overlap at UQ, which is kind of cool, especially considering we only met like 11 or 12 years later in 2020. Throughout the last decade or more, he's done some pretty cool stuff in the energy space, including his first job where he's doing a lot of things like condition assessments for the power generation industry, including in particular the coal and gas industry. He's worked for NNOC, which is now NLX, and set up their interruptible load program in the F-gas markets. Before that, he was responsible for overseeing Australia and New Zealand's demand response portfolios for NNOC. He was also the demand response lead for Flow Power, and was responsible for their demand response activities in the national electricity market, as well as their emergency reliability programs. He then went on to work with Rheem to help water system. And most recently, he's the resident energy nerd, or I think it's flexibility markets lead at Gridcog or Grid Cognition, where he helps, and they help a lot of large energy users model their projects and really realize potential value streams. He's also responsible for developing new product features and identifying new opportunities. On top of that, he started a Slack channel called Energy Nerds. He started a Substack newsletter called Currently Speaking. He's also an avid cyclist and recently started a Strava group called Velo Nem. So if you know anything about electricity markets in Australia, or if you know anything about cycling, you probably know already that I'll be speaking to Alex Leemon. Good day, Alex.
Thanks for the kind words, Ewan. How could you tell I like bikes?
I know. You couldn't pick that background better. How about maybe a solar panel as well to go behind you? That picture.
I'll have to source one.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about that eclectic early career of yours. Sort of starting in coal and now sort of working at the very cutting edge of energy.
Yeah, sure. So I studied engineering. I studied materials engineering, which is pretty niche, and actually I don't even think exists as a primary major anymore. You have to study it alongside mechanical or chemical these days. And when I graduated from materials, there's not a lot of material specific jobs going. And so I ended up working for a company called HRL Technology, which had spun out of the old SEC-V version 1. And they specialized in the area that I did was sort of condition assessment. So a lot of failure analyses in the lab, so cutting things up and inspecting them for trying to figure out how they had broken. And then we also went out onto sites a lot and did sort of the condition assessment, major overhauls of a lot of coal plants and some gas. So got to travel around the country and see the insides of lots of coal stations up and down the East Coast. That was pretty interesting. And then after doing that for a while, kind of wanted to move out of engineering in that space. And as luck had it, I knew some people who worked at NNOC, and they sort of suggested that, I could be a good fit. And so I applied and got the job there. And that was, quite a big shift. I went to market side. And I've told this story a number of times that I'd been working for a power station in Queensland, done a lot of condition assessment, one of the newer privately owned power stations in Queensland, and they had 40 full-time staff to run an 880 megawatt unit. Mm-hmm. And they had 40 or so staff in their head office in Brisbane on Eagle Street. And when I was an engineer, I was just like, how do you need 40 keyboard warriors? What are they doing back in Brisbane? And you've got these engineers who are kind of keeping this thing running and all the sophisticated machinery. And then when I went market side, I was like, oh, okay, no, I get it. It was quite eye-opening that you can work in the sector and be in this entirely separate field and have kind of no idea what's happening on the other side of the market, the other side of the sector. So that was a really interesting experience.
Tell us a bit more about that. What are the things that really demand that big workforce and probably broad expertise to manage those kind of assets?
So on the guys at the plant, you've got, like a boiler engineer, a turbine engineer, station manager. And so they're, experts in their field. You've got a team of operators that run, 24/7 shifts, keeping the the actual, this station was 2 units. You've got to keep it running. You've got sort of a handful of maintenance sort of supervisors on hand at all time. You've got, regular staff like cleaners and admin staff who keep, like, there are receptionists. There's an office at this place. And this plant ran fairly lean. It was a station designed in the early 2000s, designed to run lean. If you look at, say, the Victorian units, like, say, Loyang A or something, for example, which was built in the mid to late 80s, that has a much higher number of staff just required to keep that plant operating on a day-to-day basis. That's how it was sort of designed. Yep. And then, on the trading desk back in Brisbane, you've got a whole lot of people, responsible for the financial commitments for basically trading in the derivatives markets, as well as the spot traders. The head company actually had a couple of plants, so that they've sort of split those operations across those couple of plants. It's sort of, it was, and I think I hadn't appreciated that at the time, that, this idea was like, oh, well, the coal plant would just run flat out all the time for high capacity factors, and had kind of no concept that there's a trading team sitting at a desk in Brisbane making commercial decisions that flow down to how the units run. And increasingly, that's something, that has occurred more and more. We see coal-fired plants, for example, are doing a high degree of cycling right now with the low or negative daytime prices. They're being cycled down to their minimum ramp rates, or in some cases making decisions to shut off temporarily. And so the engineers at the sites are basically dealing with what is increased stress on the materials. So, my old consultancy would be getting a whole lot of additional work out of that. The way these cycles are being run has real physical consequences, but then there are trading decisions and sort of hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars of revenue on the line based on how these units are operated. So it's quite interesting to then think about how those two work hand in hand. And I had fairly limited appreciation for that when you're sort of working a little bubble and thinking about, the actual very small section of a plant and the condition of it.
Yeah, that's right. And then at NNOC, you as you said, you went on to the market side, working, I guess, on both generation flexibility, but also load flexibility. Could you tell us a bit about the kind of programs that you helped set up at NNOC?
Yeah, so NNOC, I came in as sort of to help kind of run the demand response programs in Australia and New Zealand. So they had, some pretty well run established demand response programs. The big one was the reserve capacity mechanism in WA. So we had a portfolio of upwards of 300 megawatts across sort of 500 plus customers in WA, everyone from sort of, big companies like Telstra and the defense space, all the way down to, individual chicken growers that had sort of a diesel genset in the corner of the shed had been signed up to this capacity mechanism. That was very well heeled. And then over in the NEM and in New Zealand, there was sort of programs, for example, for predicting system peaks. So the RCPD and you're not predicting AusNet critical peak, but managing those types of programs, as well as some spot trading. And then the RERT, the Reliability and Emergency Reserve Trader mechanism. So that when that became open to distributed loads, that's effectively a capacity mechanism demand response program. And so we could bid customers into that. So a lot of my role there was basically translating the operational rules and the market rules from Australia to the operators based in Boston and then Ireland, in Dublin, how to basically run these programs. We had a 24/7 trading desk effectively for running these programs. That was quite interesting, and got to see
a lot of early mornings and late evenings. It sounds like.
Yeah, there was a few of those. Yeah, Boston, East Coast US time zones are almost as bad as UK and Europe time zones for working on the East Coast of Australia, but we make it work. Yeah, and got a couple of trips to the US out of that, which was really interesting to see how things were done in the US and then Ireland later. And that was a big learning experience too, the shift from sort of a relatively small Australian, largely Victorian centric consultancy to now this fairly large company that had grown up out of a startup and scaled and then gone public, and then eventually, went private and sold to Enel an even bigger, a very big organization. And I left right about the time of the transition to Enel. I think about a month before I left, they put the new branding on the office.
Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah. And then you went to what was then also a fairly newly or freshly rebranded retailer in the CNI space, Flow Power. How was that like?
Yeah, Flow Power, we're looking for someone to help run their DR program. So if you're not familiar, Flow Power is a tier 2 retailer that has, at that time, they were commercial industrial only. They're now branching into residential. and they had found, I think, a really smart niche on focusing on sort of spot price pass through or variants of spot price pass through for large customers, but smaller, sort of the smaller end of large customers. And that was, so a lot of, for example, agricultural customers with large water pumping loads who have quite flexible loads. It doesn't really matter when they pump from the river. They've got dams, so long as, they manage, a certain number of hours per day. And so they're great examples of customers that can be price responsive. So I helped kind of manage a lot of those programs. And again, we bid into many similar programs to ENOC, like the RERT programs. And we had an arena trial, the very first sort of arena DR trials. Flow Power had a portfolio. So that was, again, really interesting, and got to see inside the guts of how a retailer works and learned a lot. And got to talk to a lot of different customers and see the kind of loads that we're doing in these flexibility markets.
Yeah, cool. I'm going to ask you, what's your key takeaway from after having seen the guts of a retailer? Because the one that I always say after having spent time with, in particular, 2 retailers, is don't go into retail. What's yours?
I think retailing is a lot harder than most people realize. There are a lot of icebergs in the water, and there are a lot of things that could go wrong. When you can make it work, I think retailing can be a great business, and you can make a testament to, obviously there are some very good smaller retailers out there doing a great job, but it's not an easy business. I think many people think retailing is pretty easy.
So. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Cool. And then from Flow Power, you went into and worked for Reem for a bit, working on their sort of grid-directed hot water system, which maybe in one sentence, if you can describe what that's all about.
Yeah, so Reem came up with a product called the Power Store, and it's an electric resistance hot water heater. But the clever thing about it is it has a variable resistance heater. So basically you can ramp the element from 0 up to 3.6 kilowatts. And then it has an internet connected control device that then allows you to do things like be spot price responsive, to map it to your solar consumption so that you can use your own solar to heat the water and the device in your water heater, as well as, more exotic things we were going to test with the arena trial of FCAS for water heaters, which is genuinely wild, but not physically impossible. As a sort of a side story, there's doing FCAS, which was something I did at ENOC. Typically, you need pretty hefty and expensive technical equipment to basically do the high-speed logging. So the Australian rules, the NEM rules, you have to measure up to 50 milliseconds resolution. And that, typically requires fairly expensive power meters to do that, which doesn't matter when you're operating at a commercial scale. You can you can afford those costs, but if you're operating at a residential scale, then it just doesn't work. Yeah. And Reem is one of 2 companies that basically figured out how to build devices that could do these high-speed logging at a sort of a much, much lower cost. So instead of thousands, a couple of $100s, which now makes this technology feasible at a residential scale. So that was kind of exciting and interesting to see what we could do with these devices. Again, a totally interesting insight into the challenges of these devices. So Reem, which is historically a B2B business, they sell to plumbing companies, was sort of making a bit of a B2C shift to do some of this. And that was really interesting to watch. There's a whole host of challenges when you think about rolling this stuff out at residential scale. Yeah. And I think it was interesting to see, I still think the technology was quite good and the idea was sound, but it's very interesting to see that the challenges of, I think everyone gets excited about resi because there's such a big scale. There's literally millions of customers and the aggregate load is significant and there's a lot we could do there. But when you actually get down to the nitty gritty of, a plumber rolling out in a truck to a single house and starting to work on something, there's a lot of challenges along the way. And it's I think something that, all of the businesses in the energy sector are effectively still struggling with this challenge to some degree or more or less.
Yeah, no, good point. Because it's, you can have the best product in the world, but if you're not the product that the plumber thinks of when your hot water system breaks, then it's not going to happen, right? It's a whole different type of consideration, the whole customer journey.
Yeah, after I'd left Reem, I had this experience firsthand where my hot water heater broke, which is it was a gas storage unit. And I had an experience with a plumber who basically just wanted to sell me a gas instantaneous and had zero interest in considering anything else, heat pumps included. And I experienced firsthand this frustration of being, a knowledgeable consumer on the end of a tradie who just wasn't, all sorts of excuses and stuff. It was quite a frustrating experience. So that was eye-opening.
Yeah, I can relate. It's interesting too. If you look at that technology of being able to, I guess, ramp an electrical element of, that obviously the typical technology has been around for many decades now. Just being able to switch on and off with an electrical element and store the water. But sort of part of my brain thinks, well, why would you use an inefficient way of heating water when you now have obviously heat pump or water systems that can, perhaps use 20% or 25% of the energy of that system? But then the other half of my brain says, well, it's having that large flexible load is more valuable than having a small flexible load. For example, smart EV charging is also particularly useful in terms of flexing load, whether that's on or off in the market, to make some really big impact. We'll dig into maybe a little bit on EV flexibility later on, but it's an interesting one to ponder.
Yeah, definitely.
And I guess we'll leave your current job at Gridcog for now. That's obviously a really interesting one, but I think a lot of people know what you do there. But how do you I mentioned in the intro that you do a lot of other really interesting things in the energy industry, and I think you take a lot of people along on the journey with you, which is, I think, just fantastic. As I said, you've got energy nerds, you got currently speaking, you've got now the cycling group, and I think all those things are, I think, it's such an awesome way to, I guess, both invite people into the sort of close-knit industry that we're all in, and kind of getting people on the journey. But how do you find the time to create those extracurricular activities in your, but I'm sure it's a pretty busy work day and a private life too?
I honestly have no idea. I don't sleep a lot. I have small children that do that job already partly for me, and probably because I'm a giant nerd, I do this instead of watching Netflix or whatever. This is kind of what I do in the evenings. So yeah,
Fair
maybe
enough.
when I go back to watching Netflix, you'll see that output drop off. But I think something that has often stuck with me is, I'm not a programmer. Probably this role at Gridcog is the closest experience I come to getting to see, that. It's been quite interesting seeing how a software company works and how software developers think. I like the ethos and the mentality of open source, which obviously there's an almost philosophical movement around open source in some parts of the community. And energy is this sector that, I think strongly back to Eninoc. Eninoc's recruiting career was, unlike, say, where I started in an engineering consultancy. It's very clear. You need an engineering degree and ideally particular types of engineering, and then you get a job and you train up in certain areas. Eninoc was doing demand response. There's no degree you can do demand response. And so they were just going to universities and saying sort of, okay, great, you've got an economics degree, you've got an arts degree, you've got a commerce degree, are you sort of willing to learn? Can you think on your feet? Great, you've got a job, and you'll learn this stuff on the fly. And so, coming into that world, that yes, I'd been working for a number of years and I had an engineering degree and I'd seen inside a power station, I knew nothing about demand response and very little around how the market worked. And so there was a huge amount of learning on the job. And AMO does, like, this is not me ragging on AMO, they do a very good job and publish some really great resources, but there is just this huge body of knowledge that is just not clearly documented or buried or hidden and not well known. And some of that is, there are people who've been around the industry a long time who just, it's at the top of their head, they know that, but for a lot of other people, it's not. Yeah. And so I think it's important to get this stuff out and to help people, because the more people are aware of this, the more that information is told. I think that helps us all. And partly with currently speaking, the original genesis was also some just like communicating what's happening in the energy sector to people who are not in the energy sector. And I think it was started. I was riding with a friend of mine who was looking at getting solar panels, and he said, like, I want to get solar panels, but the feed-in tariffs are going down to zero. What the hell, man? I was like, okay, well, this is why. Like, and whether you agree that there should be fixed feed-in tariffs or incentives for customers, like, but even just explaining the story of, it's not some big evil conspiracy of retailers trying to screw you on feed-in tariff. there are physical things happening in the markets that are underpinning these events. And so being able to communicate that to people helps, actually spread the message and at least explain what's going on. So
yeah, totally. And it's a little bit like when, let's say when you pitch a business idea to someone, and the first thing an investor is going to ask for is, what's the moat? What's the thing that's protecting your technology? I think the electricity industry, and I'm probably speaking mostly from power generation and electricity networks, they have very, very big moats. They, as you said, they have a lot of technical jargon. It's particular. I mean, for anyone that's been trying to get a meeting with someone at, say, a distribution network provider or a DNSP, it's one of the trickiest things in the world, because they're this big machine. They serve millions of customers. They have that sort of old school engineering thinking, as opposed to what I think you're describing, which is more the the open source, maybe the newer type of engineer that wants to show how stuff works to then make it better.
Yeah, I think part of it is if I have to go to a family event and listen to someone tell me about how SMRs are the future again, I'm going to go crazy. So it's just communicating this stuff more broadly and actually talking about it. I think it's important, and yeah, within the industry and outside the industry. Yeah,
on behalf of many people in the industry that don't have the deep level of expertise as you do, thanks for having those available. I think it's super, super helpful.
Pleasure. Anytime.
Maybe I can pick your brain a little bit on some of those areas where you have particularly deep expertise on, particularly kind of the flexibility markets in Australia. What's in maybe just a couple of minutes. I know it's probably hard to distill a career in a couple of minutes, but it'd be interesting to hear maybe your thoughts on the FCAS market in Australia at the moment, the demand response market, and perhaps some of the recent developments in that space, and what we should be looking out for.
Yeah, I mean, so the very brief story. So FCAS stands for Frequency Control Ancillary Services. Right now in the NEM, there are 10 of those markets, which is kind of wild. They're split. The majority of them are contingency markets, which is basically responding to when there's a sudden event on the grid, for example, a network element or a coal-fired, large sort of coal-fired power station dropping offline. Doesn't have to be coal, but they do. That will cause the system frequency to either drop or rise, and you need then resources that can respond to that rapidly in a matter of seconds. In 2017, there was a rule change that basically allowed distributed aggregated portfolios to participate. So historically, you needed 1 megawatt at a single site to participate, and there are not that many sites that can kind of do that. And the rule change allowed aggregators like Eninoc to enter the market and basically aggregate up lots of smaller customer loads, and now you had a portfolio of multiple megawatts that you could offer into the market. I think the timing was interesting because it coincided with a step change, a big lift in the prices, which occurred sort of in mid 2016. And so it went from this sort of kind of slightly arcane, ancillary services sort of side market that lots of people did. It was obviously essential to the operation of the system, to now something that was actually fairly valuable on its own, and it attracted a lot of interest. And so both demand response, which was what we were primarily doing at Eninoc, and then later the rise of batteries, both residential batteries and the slightly larger batteries, at a community battery or a commercial industrial battery, they can get value out of these markets. And so that's been very valuable. And just last month or the month before, we've had the 1 second market, which is those 9 and 10th markets have been introduced. And again, batteries and demand response are actually the only technologies right now participating in those markets. And the values are extremely high. So there's lots of people making a lot of money out of those new very high speed markets right now.
Interesting.
So yeah, and if you look at who's providing these, it's these big sort of commercial portfolios, whether they're made up of those demand response commercial portfolios. So people who have loads that are flexible enough, things like cold stores or pumps that can be switched off rapidly and not interrupt their operations. Obviously, it's a bit harder to do a factory, to have a factory randomly shut off in the middle of the day because of frequency. That's not a viable proposition. But there are various manufacturing other processes that you can do this.
Yep.
And then batteries have been the big winners. So all of the sort of various residential VPPs around the country have been participating in these markets, and that's sort of growing, year on year as more people sort of put batteries at their home and then sign up to these programs. That's a major revenue stream for most of how these VPP economics work.
And presumably, as more and more of the large scale, coal-fired generators are switched off over the next decade or two, there's going to be more likely more volatility and more action in the space. Do you think?
Yeah, there's two funny tensions there. So as the larger coal-fired stations switch off, you actually reduce the size of the contingency on the system. So you actually need to procure less FCAS, although that statement is not true if Kogan Creek, which is the biggest system unit on the system right now, and also literally the newest station in the entire NEM, 2007. So that kind of drives that contingency size that you need to procure FCAS for. So that's kind of keeping the procurement high. But you're right, as we start to lose these large units, there's sort of less need for it, but then that's offset by less people able to provide it. So long term, a lot of people are predicting that the prices will come out of these markets as basically more batteries are providing the service, and that need starts to reduce. There's also, contrary to I guess maybe popular belief, there's no physical reason why wind and solar farms can't provide this if they have the right technology, and there have been some trials. And there is actually a solar farm, Kayamel Solar Farm, currently providing FCAS, which is contingency FCAS, which is interesting. So, if the value is there and we see that market topography change, then we will see more of these sort of non-traditional technologies start to do these services, which will be interesting.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I had a very, very small involvement in the very early development stages of the Kayamel Solar Farm, probably well ahead of it being built, and it's probably quite different to what it is now. But that one's in the northwestern Victoria, isn't that right?
Yeah, now you're testing me. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Testing
Yeah.
that's the direction there. Yeah, sorry. No, that's very cool. I was going to ask you a few questions on the role of electric vehicles in the flexibility. I think I probably have a pretty good idea of, and I think the listeners have a good idea of your thoughts on it. Maybe what I'll throw in instead is, we've talked a little bit about open source. We talked about batteries. We've touched on electric vehicles. I have to ask you about Tesla, Elon Musk, and Cybertruck, and maybe about X. Let's throw that in there as well. What's your thoughts on the whole drama?
It feels like watching. I mean, it feels like watching. Yeah, honestly, for all of Musk's odd person, how to say it feels like the emperor's clothes have come off with this. It's a very weird thing to watch, and it's also weird to see, a man that's at the head of two pretty interesting businesses that have driven, technology and developments ahead, to then basically get into this weird, rabbit hole of Twitter or X or whatever it is, and it seems largely very pointless and silly and a distraction from his much more interesting work with Tesla.
It is probably fair perhaps for us to maybe draw a big distinction there, that obviously like Tesla Energy is its own thing, and it is extremely well, I think, operated and well regarded. Tesla as cars, I've got a Tesla, love that car, and I think that they do amazing things in that space. So perhaps some of these things are just kind of noise and I guess personal PR, and perhaps a personality that perhaps shouldn't be spending as much time in the limelight and maybe should be working more on those problems. What do you think?
I mean, maybe it's evidence that he was not the technical genius behind many of the products, that it's, the teams of engineers and product designers actually at the companies who are the people who, doing the work and driving these things. But I think Tesla Energy is an interesting one. You say that, you mean Tesla's now, as of quite recently, picked up a retail license in Australia. I think that will be an interesting play. A colleague asked me about that recently. I think in some ways, I'm not sure how big a dent they'll be able to make. Being a small retailer in the NEM is very challenging to scale, particularly in the resi space. Just to scale, to get your first 1,000 customers might be, relatively achievable in a year or under, but to start to scale beyond, 10, 50, 100,000 customers is difficult. The one thing they have going for them is obviously very good brand recognition whether that is, relates to Musk and his personality or not. Tesla make good looking products. Their battery looks good. The home battery looks good. And honestly, I think some of the other battery competitors have not probably put enough thought into the fact that you're making a consumer device. It's going to sit on the side of the house or in the garage, and you're going to walk past it most days. And if it's a big ugly brick, like it matters. Like, you can pretend not that we're not vain, but like it does matter. Like the things in your house do matter. So
absolutely, and people are happy to spend that 15 grand on the Tesla product as opposed to a competing product that might be exactly the same in terms of specs, but might only be $10,000. So it's the value of the brand there, I think, is hugely important, and it's really impressive that they've been able to build what they have.
They have. I mean, it was interesting at Reem, Solar Heart, one of their business, that they sold Tesla batteries, and the story that came up through that business is that some of the working behind the scenes with Tesla could actually be quite frustrating. They changed inventory prices. You could be left dead in the water. You've got overstocked inventory at a higher price, and challenges with that. But the brand perception with end consumers is enormous, and people come and ask buy brand name for a Tesla. They're not asking for a battery; they're asking for a Tesla battery. And so I think it is an interesting play to move into that retail space. And Tesla's obviously, with their batteries, has been critical to the current VPPs out there. And so that would be an interesting space to watch. And then obviously, as Tesla's still the leading EV car brand in Australia, with BYD nipping at their heels. So, there is obviously a large fleet of vehicles that they've got data on. They have the supercharger network. And if they can then use that retail license to drive into sort of, more interesting flex markets, that will be an interesting play to see what happens there.
Yeah, totally. We're getting towards the pointy end of the chat. A couple more questions I wanted to just pick your brain on. One is, really keen to hear what's the most interesting project that you've ever worked on in your career?
I mean, the one that stands out just in terms of interest and I think novelty was getting to work on the interruptible load program with Enernox. So that this rule change allowed aggregated, distributed resources or distributed demand response participants into the FCAS markets. Enernox had been doing this same kind of thing in New Zealand, so they were pretty well versed in kind of what needed to be done. There was a team of people that worked on it to get it up and running in sort of pretty quickly, so that we could enter the market when the rule changed. But just I think the novelty of being able to say you have a cold store and they have this refrigeration load, and you can put a controller on the box, a control box on the wall, and it's receiving live frequency, measuring the frequency of the power system in real time at very high resolution. And if something happens, if the frequency drops, it will cut the load to the cold store for up to 10 minutes. The cold store will then kind of boot back up. There is almost no, change presence, to the actual operations of that cold store. And then there's this revenue payment that comes through. And that's kind of huge, because we talk about this idea of, CER, that, consumer energy resources and prosumers and the role of customers in the energy market. That's very much at the heart of that. And it's, that was, I think, really interesting. And technically, there's actually a lot that goes on in building that, not just the hardware and the technical requirements, but there's also market interfacing requirements. Like, these are assets that need to be bid in, because the market rules were originally written for large centrally operated power plants like coal plants. And so you're sort of adapting then, how can you operate this fleet of tens or hundreds of sort of distributed resources as if they were, a centralized power plant. And again, takes slightly harder, than it's easier to write it on paper.
Yeah. Fascinating. Now, the last question I had to do with, obviously, we have some very, very big renewable energy targets in Australia coming up for 2030. What can we expect to see in the sort of electricity generation space between now and 2030? Do you think there's any particular technologies that we're not seeing now that can help bring a bit of a paradigm shift to where we need to be?
This is a scary question. SMRs. No. I think I think that the realization we've had quite recently, it's late 2023 when we're talking. We've just had the federal government recently announce a capacity investment scheme with a huge, uptick. I think that's a realization that the energy transition is not going to be easy, probably not going to be cheap, but it's essentially the government stepping up and honoring the commitments that they said they're going to do and stepping in to do something about that. I think that's significant because we've had a decade of pretty rudderless and ambitionless energy targets from our federal government. That's caused, that's caused a patchwork of various state governments to do different things, sometimes, causing tension between the state and the Fed and lots of, and so to have the federal government actually step up and really start to drive this, I think is significant and it's needed. And so I think that's the big thing is as that realization comes through, we start to actually drive that. I think the question is, will that momentum stay? What happens if Labor doesn't stick around for the next term? What's the opposition's energy policy? Because right now they just seem to be saying, vague comments about next generation nuclear, but with no actual plan. So what does that momentum look through to 2030? I don't know. And on dark days, it scares me a little bit, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, fair enough.
We do have some big scary targets, and we're currently struggling. So, but I hope for the sector, there's lots of very smart, ambitious, and interesting people working in that space, and so it's good to see there's a lot happening out there, and perhaps a lot of it is happening sort of quietly. For every press release and negative op-ed about a transmission line not being built or something, a generation plant not being built, there are hundreds of people quietly working around in the background and solving this problem. And so when you actually see what those people are doing and when the projects do come to fruition, that's really exciting and pretty great to see. So
yeah, I agree. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for your time, Alex. Really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure we'll probably see you out on the road with the Velo NEM soon.
Thanks very much for having me.